A Family Elopement by HG Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Krista Zaleski. A Family Elopement. "Your wife does not notice our being together?" asked Miss Hawkins. "I think not," said Mr. Gabbitas. "She is talking to that theosophist." The theosophist was a slender young man from India, but his hair might have come from the Sudan. Mrs. Gabbitas was a lady with intellectual features of a Roman type, and a shallow desire for profundity. She was clearly very much interested in what the Hindu had to say, so Miss Hawkins turned again to Gabbitas. "I said I cannot go on like this," said Gabbitas. "Speak lower," said Miss Hawkins. "I cannot go on like this, dearest," said Gabbitas, trying to put as much tender passion as possible into a hoarse whisper. "What can we do?" said Miss Hawkins. "So much as we dare do. Flight," said Gabbitas. "Let us get out of all this into a sunnier clime." "Hush! They are coming to ask me to sing," said Miss Hawkins. "Presently. Wait." Mr. Gabbitas yielded her up at this crisis with the best grace he could, and went and propped himself against a wall where he could watch her profile. "She is awfully clever," said the refined young gentleman to the left of him, to his friend. "And virtuous," said his friend. "But that's a mistake. She really ought to do something just a little cheerful, you know. People are not going to run after singers just because they sing, you know." "She knows that," said the refined young gentleman. "She's clever enough. There will be an exploit." "Good heavens," said Gabbitas under his breath. "Such motives in my sweet little Minnie. I can't stand this." And he hastily sought a vacant piece of wall elsewhere. "It is sweet to be with you again," he whispered to her presently, with a sense of infinite relief. "And now, dearest, frankly, dare you, come with me? If you knew, dearest, how I have longed for you, how my soul craves. So," very loud, "I had a very jolly time indeed." The latter inane sentence because somebody had loomed up just behind Miss Hawkins' chair. "Gone now," said Gabbitas. "Tell me, dearest, quickly. Whisper. Dare you?" Pause. "For you," whispered Miss Hawkins very softly, looking down. Gabbitas took that as an affirmative. "My darling, my own, the warmth will show. I mean to say, do you find the room hot? What disconcerts you now?" I caught Mrs. Gabbitas's eye just then. "I think she wants to go home. That theosophist has left her." Now, qualified observers state that a man who means to run away from his wife, even if that wife have features Roman rather than beautiful, and a tendency to theosophy, suffers considerable twinges of compunction. Gabbitas certainly did. Even if one's marriage is chiefly a success from the mercenary point of view, a habit of mutual consideration grows insensibly out of the necessity of a common life. "It was a very successful affair, dear," he remarked. "They had some lovely sandwiches, I noticed." "Yes," said Mrs. Gabbitas, turning dreamy eyes upon him. "The sandwiches were lovely, and the decorations were lovely too, and the music. It has been the most lovely evening I can imagine. I'm glad you liked it so much, dear." She smiled mysteriously at him. She seemed to be suddenly affected with an unusual tenderness. "Dear husband," she said. "What is up now?" thought Gabbitas. "She is not going to pump me." And he remarked, "Yes, dear." "You have always been a good husband to me, dear." "Rather," said Gabbitas privately, and aloud, "always." "You may kiss me, dear." Gabbitas did as he was bid, and that was all. After this treat, Mrs. Gabbitas relapsed into her corner. She did not suspect then, after all. Gabbitas was greatly relieved. Yet she had never spoken in quite this way before. If she meant to develop sentimentality, a new inducement was added to elopement. And again, and yet again, there 3 times altogether in a fortnight, Mrs. Gabbitas returned to this same peculiar soft mood. 1 or 2 things she said startled Gabbitas extremely at the time. However, he kept on accumulating his luggage at his chambers nevertheless, for he was a hard man. "She cannot know," he said to himself, following her with his eyes, after one of these conversations. "No, if she knew she would make a shindy. She would certainly make a shindy. I know her disposition. I suppose she has got this new style from some novel. Poor old Mimsy." As he went by her door, he paused momentarily, for she seemed to be on her knees and weeping by the bedside. That was through looking out of the corner of his eyes. When he looked straight, he saw that she was only packing a dress basket, and he went on downstairs relieved. 5 days after the last of these remarkable conversations, Gabbitas found himself on the Southampton platform of Waterloo Station, with a large pile of boxes, masculine and feminine, in his care, and an exhilarating sense of wrongdoing in his heart. Miss Hawkins mingled timidity with self-possession delightfully. "This is the end of London and respectability," said Gabbitas. "And the beginning of life, dear," said Miss Hawkins. "Here is our luggage," said Gabbitas. By the side of their heap was a similar one. A little portmanteau in this caught his eye. It seemed familiar. "Is that not mine?" he asked the porter. "Mrs. da Costa," read the porter on the label, "for Lisbon." "No, that is not mine," said Gabbitas. And yet it seemed somehow funny. "We should see that our seats have not been taken, I think, dear." At the door of their compartment a man was standing with his back towards them. He was evidently a foreigner. His hair formed a peculiar frizzy mat, such as no Englishman could or would exhibit. As they approached, he turned. There was a pause of mutual inquiry. "Mr. Jamasji Ganpat," said Gabbitas. Mr. Ganpat, the eminent theosophist, looked at them stupidly. He seemed scared for a moment, then his face lit up. He raised his hat. "Mr. Gabbitas, with Miss Hawkins." Miss Hawkins turned half round to pull a loose thread out of her travelling rug. "We are going down to Southampton," said Mr. Gabbitas, collecting his resources. "Together, to meet Mrs. Gabbitas." "Indeed," said Mr. Ganpat, and his eye wandered round to the waiting-room door. He seemed nervous. "Do you know," he said, "I think I had better. It is unfortunate. Excuse me." He turned his back suddenly and hurried away. "It was better to recognize him," said Gabbitas. "How nervous he seems. I wonder if he suspects. Perhaps he is shocked. Hello!" Ganpat had not been able to reach the door to the waiting-room in time. It opened. Somebody appeared in a grey travelling dress, a flaxen-haired lady with Roman features, smiling sweetly at him. "Mimsy!" exclaimed Gabbitas with addenda. "Mrs. Gabbitas," said Miss Hawkins. The smile of Mrs. Gabbitas died away at the sight of Ganpat's alarmed visage. She sought over his shoulder for the cause. "Oh, my poor George!" she exclaimed faintly. And then she saw Miss Hawkins. "You!" "Take your seats," howled the guard. "Take your seats, please." "I suppose," said Gabbitas, finding curses sotto voce no comfort, "under the circumstances we had all better get in together and explain." And in a minute 4 singularly depressed and silent people were travelling in a first-class compartment out of Waterloo Station. It was one of those conversations that are difficult to begin. Mrs. Gabbitas broke the silence at Vauxhall. "This is perfectly ridiculous," she said abruptly and hotly. "Idiotic! We can't do anything now." "That, dear, is just what I feel," said Miss Hawkins very slowly, and without looking up, making a new kind of sinuous strip. "It will not be even a romantic scandal," said Mrs. Gabbitas with tears in her voice. "Nothing original. It will just be funny, horrible, beastly." The meeting lapsed into silence. "I do not know," said Mr. Ganpat with a half-laugh. "What? It is funny." Again meditation reigned. Beyond Clapham, Gabbitas cleared his throat. "Yes," said Mrs. Gabbitas. "We have," said Gabbitas, "got into this mess, and we have to get out of it. I and Ganpat might fight." "No," said Ganpat. "Ladies present, no fight." "We might fight," said Gabbitas, "but I do not see exactly what we should be fighting for." "Precisely," said Ganpat. "Nothing worth fighting for." He smiled reassuringly at Mrs. Gabbitas. "The reputations of the ladies must not suffer," said Gabbitas. "Again, precisely," said Ganpat, becoming animated. "And now you hear me. Now I will tell you. What will we do? Here is Mrs. Gabbitas and Mrs. Hawkins. They go with us to Southampton. Quite proper that, eh? Hear me to my final end. Then we part. I and you, Mr. Gabbitas. I and you go to Paris. Is that not well? It is an excursion that we have planned. You, madame, go with Miss Hawkins. You go to... Lisbon will be far enough, as the things are labelled. Yes, said Miss Hawkins, taking her strips and tearing them transversely into squares. It's sensible. I'm sure I don't mind, now. That is admirable. What do you say, Gabbitas? The eye of Gabbitas rested on Miss Hawkins for a moment. This is a beastly mess, he said. Miss Hawkins glanced up, and he fancied she nodded imperceptibly. He turned to Ganpat. Very well, that will do. We have all been very silly, said Mrs. Gabbitas. Idiots, in fact. As far as I can see, said her husband, nobody can throw stones. There is no injured innocence in this carriage at all, said Mr. Jamassi Ganpat. And now, said Mrs. Gabbitas, everything being settled, let us talk of something else. Ringlets, said Miss Hawkins, making her paper scraps into 2 heaps in her lap. Ringlets, dear, are coming into fashion after all. End of A Family Elopement by H.G. Wells.